May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. It's been said that among all the changes of this world, there are two constants. One is death, and the other is taxes. I would suggest to you that perhaps there is even a third, and that is war. War seems to be something that continues throughout the ages. If we look back at the history of Israel, we find that at the death of King Solomon, the country was not able to be held together, and so it was divided in half. The northern kingdom was called Israel, the southern kingdom was called Judah. During this time, the Assyrians became quite powerful, and it was in 721 that the Assyrians, after taking over much of the land around them, came down and took the northern kingdom of Israel and destroyed it. Following the Assyrians, the Babylonians rose up. They destroyed the Assyrians, and in 587 BC, they came down and took over the southern kingdom of Judah, set many of its people into exile up to Babylon. After the Assyrians, the Babylonians, came Cyrus and the Persians. They defeated the Babylonians, and 50 years later they allowed these Jews in exile to return back to Jerusalem and to Judah. It was in the early 300s that Alexander the Great from Greece rose up and began to conquer even more territory than his predecessors. And in 312 BC, he came in and overtook Judah again. One of the things that Alexander did that other conquerors did not do was that he left behind him, in each country that he conquered, he left behind him people from Greece who would teach these conquered nations about the culture of Greece and the Greek language. And so he did the same thing in Judah. Consequently, what happened was that the official language of all of these countries was now Greek. And that's why the New Testament is written not in Hebrew, but in Greek. Did Jesus understand Greek? I would say he probably did. We don't know if he spoke it. He undoubtedly spoke a dialect of Hebrew called Aramaic. But nevertheless, Greek was the language of the land. And Paul, who evangelized up into Turkey, what is now Turkey, and into Greece, had no trouble speaking to these people. And he wrote to them in Greek. And so our New Testament is written in Greek. Paul's letters, the Gospels. This is all in Greek. And so as we look at our Gospel this morning, it shouldn't be surprising to us that Greeks are spoken of. There are Greeks who have come up for the Passover of the Jews. They had undoubtedly heard of Jesus, and now they wanted to see Jesus. Not just see him like somebody would see a movie star or an actor on a stage. They wanted to meet Jesus. And so they go through the disciples to see if that's possible. And Jesus now, upon hearing that outsiders, non-Jews, want to see him, has this interesting reaction. And he says, the hour has now come for the Son of Man to be glorified. The Son of Man is what he calls himself. He never speaks of himself as Jesus. We read this sentence, and we wonder, if we stop there, what's going to happen? We don't use the word glory or glorified too much today, except we hear it in church. I know sometimes if you end up seeing someone who is naked, you might say, well, there he is in all his glory. More likely, though, we would look at a king or a queen in all their splendor. The king may be decked out in a uniform, the queen in a gown, crowns on their heads, carrying gold and jewelry. And we say, there they are in all their splendor, in all their glory. And so if we think of Jesus being glorified, the first thing I would think of would be something like the Transfiguration. We had this story about a little over a month ago, where he took Peter, James, and John up to the top of a mountain, and there he was transfigured. His clothes became whiter than snow and gleaming like the sun. And they could see who he really was. They could see his glory. Or again, Jesus speaks about coming back at the end of time on the clouds of glory with his angels. And so we get this picture of something that is wonderful and magnificent and splendid. But immediately following this, Jesus begins to speak about death. He waxes poetically about a grain of wheat that must fall to the earth and die in order for a plant to grow, in order for there to be more wheat. And he says how important it is for this death to happen. He talks about a person who loves his life so much that he loses it. But he says, for those who hate life on this earth, they will gain eternal life. It reminds me of what he said in the Gospel of St. Matthew. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break in and steal. But rather store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not corrupt and where thieves cannot break in and steal. We have this contrast, you see, between what we think of what glory is and what Jesus now thinks of glory. And it's two entirely different things. Jesus understands glory as obeying the Father, no matter what he has to do. You know the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And Martin Luther, when he explains that, says this means we should fear, love, and trust God above all things. We love and trust ourselves more than anything else. But Jesus was the one who could fear, love, and trust God above all things. And so when Jesus goes to the cross, He dies as a sacrifice for us. He who obeyed God and loved God completely didn't deserve to die. But he gives his life as a sacrifice so that we are not thrown into outer darkness, so that we are not divorced and separated from God forever, but rather that we can become the sons and daughters of God as he meant it to be. When he is lifted up, you see, he's not talking about being lifted up onto a throne. He's being lifted up onto a cross. But it is from this cross that he rules. It is on this cross that God forgives us. It is from the cross that God accepts us. The cross is the gate into heaven. There is no other way to the Father except through the forgiveness found in his Son. There's no back door. There's no other heaven we can get into. There's one heaven, and the entrance is through the cross of Christ. And so this is his glory, because it is now the way that God has devised so that all, you, me, and everyone else, can be accepted by God. This is what he glories in. And so this is what is so important. When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. Everyone. This is the only way to God. When you go to seminary, one of the things a seminarian must do towards the end of the time he is there is to have a quarter doing what they call CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. And it's done in a clinical session. I did mine at the Lutheran Hospital down here in Brooklyn. Not the present Lutheran Hospital, it used to be at another place, a much older facility. And I thought it was one of the most valuable things that I ever had. There was a small group of us, and we were supervised by a man who had been trained to help us, to meet with us every day, and to talk about how we minister to those really in need. I just want to read something very quickly to you about the experiences of another man who had gone through this clinical pastoral education. He writes, "My first day, I was assigned as chaplain to a woman who was in the last stages of lung cancer. I entered her hospital room with a cheery, 'Good morning.' She cursed me and told me she didn't want any blankety-blank chaplain hanging around her. I left. Then the head nurse told me she's addicted to cigarettes. That's how she got in this fix. She's not allowed to smoke by herself. If you go back and tell her that you were willing to sit with her while she sucks on those cancer sticks, she will let you stay." I gulped, but did just that. She let me stay, and I sat there watching her inhale the smoke that was causing her death. Between her gasps, she told me that she had been raised as a Catholic, but she despised the church and hadn't been in a Catholic church for years. In the subsequent weeks, I visited her and watched her smoke at least twice a day. She told me about her childhood. Her cancer seemed a sad way for her rather sad life to end. Repeatedly, she told me about her anger at the church. No friends or family ever visited her, so far as I know. Each day, she became weaker as the cancer made it more difficult for her to breathe. Then one day, between gasps, she asked, "Can you get me a crucifix?" I guess so. I'm a Protestant, but I'm sure I can find a way to get you a crucifix. "Why do you want a crucifix?" I asked. "None of your damn business," she gasped. I got her a crucifix on a string of rosary beads and presented it to her. She took it without comment. In all my succeeding visits, I found her clutching that crucifix to her chest as her chest heaved up and down in labored breathing. And the next to the last day before she slipped into a coma, she said to me unexpectedly, "You know," gasp, "why I want this?" Another gasp. "I would really like to know," I said. He has been there," she said, lifting the tiny figure of Christ on the cross. "He's been there. He knows." Another gasp. "There's nothing that they done to me," gasp, "that they didn't do," gasp, "to him. He knows." She died 2 days later with Christ on the cross clutched in her hands. I said that she asked me to go find the crucifix. I think it's more accurate for me to say that Christ on the cross, Christ the crucified, found her. He finishes up by saying, "I didn't grow up in a church with a large crucifix, Christ the crucifix over the altar. Maybe I should have. That suffering woman could look at the crucifix and see God. She, who wanted hope, who longed to see the point of it all, saw Jesus, Jesus on a cross, like a great magnet, drawing the suffering, needy ones to himself." We all will find ourselves in front of the cross sooner or later. Blessed, I should say happy, are those who find the entrance to heaven before we die. And happy are those who find it earlier in their lives, so that people like you and me can live knowing that we have a God who every day reaches out to us, who every day loves us, forgives us, and wants only the best for us. Finally, to welcome us home. Amen. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Our next hymn is 353.